Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Katrina Lashley. I'm a program coordinator here at Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Past and Future of Environmental Justice, 30 years since the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. Tonight's event is the fourth in the series, Knowing Our Past, Creating Our Future, developed in collaboration with Current Movements and Visionary Organizing Lab. Previous discussions have explored the history of Black created institutions in D.C., community control of land and housing, and youth leadership. And tonight we turn our attention to the environmental justice movement, grounding ourselves in the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, which took place 30 years ago, October 24th to the 27th in 1991. Participants representing civil rights, environmental, health, community development, and faith organizations from across the US, Canada, Central and South America, and the Marshall Islands forever transformed notions of the environment and environmentalism, energizing and supporting the work of environmental justice networks and precipitating reflections within mainstream environmental organizations who sought to address charges of exclusivity and a lack of diversity. Tonight's conversation is also inspired by the museum's ongoing environmental work, which for the past 11 years has explored and documented various communities' definitions of, engagement with, and advocacy for the environment. As always, we welcome your comments and your questions. Please feel free to add your comments to the chat, your questions to the Q&A, and also for those attendees joining us on Facebook. We are once again led this evening by Matt Birkhold, Executive Director of Visionary Organizing Lab, and Katie Petitt, Executive Director of Current Movements. Matt creates opportunities for people to contribute their gifts to the world around them. He believes deeply in people's capacity to transform and prize himself on assuming responsibility for nurturing that capacity in himself and others. These commitments have led him to Visionary Organizing Lab, where he develops systematic ways for people to see themselves in connections to larger systems and supports people in creating new systems that are sustainable and dignity affirming. Katie Petitt re-envisions community-driven initiatives as a new basis for racial justice, global solidarity, and peace building. Petitt is the founder and executive director of Current Movements, a DC-based organization connecting grassroots movements through art, film, and technology. Petitt is also an arts and cultural organizer in DC, which has organized with groups such as Black Lives Matter DC, Movement for Black Lives DC, and DC Mutual Aid Network. She brings her love of the arts to her consulting work, where she focuses on strategic planning, organizational culture, event planning, storytelling, conflict transformation, exhibition curation, and fundraising. And I'll turn the event over to you. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you so much, Katrina, and thank you so much for everyone who is here today. We really, really appreciate your attendance and your interest in this event. And yeah, I'll get started with introducing the series. As was said before, this is the fourth in the series. And the idea is that Washington, D.C. is widely seen as a site of large national protests, but it also has a long history, but rarely discussed past of local activism in and outside the electoral arena. In the 60s, activists in Washington, D.C. created schools. They successfully organized to stop freeway construction in D.C. neighborhoods. They created practices for neighborhood governance, stopped urban renewal projects, created parks, green spaces, youth centers, and local food systems. D.C.'s activists also organized to establish home rule and gained shadow representation at the national level. In addition to this local activity, DC was also home to activists and organizers who made significant contributions to national and global social movements. Through this ongoing series, we are looking to understand why DC was fertile ground for this kind of institution building. And we believe that by answering this question, today's organizers might be better able to build alternative institutions to further DC's great organizing traditions. Tonight's no different than all of the amazing work that I listed earlier, and we'll be looking at the 30th anniversary of the People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, which took place here in DC, and we're going to have an intergenerational dialogue with longtime and emerging EJ, environmental justice activists, as we reflect on the historic summit and its continuing relevance for today's struggle. I'm going to kick it over to Matt, who's going to introduce our wonderful panelists for tonight.
Thanks, Katie, for that. Excuse me. Thanks, Katie, for that very thorough introduction. And Katrina, thank you for your very kind introduction of me. Tonight's panelists, only one of whom I've had prior conversations with, but from our are getting ready for the event, I can tell we're going to have an incredible conversation because these are some personalities who are fun to be around and have a great deal to say. The first person I'll introduce is Vernice Miller-Travis. She is the Executive Vice President at Metropolitan Group and has over 30 years of experience in environmental and civil rights policy development and is sought after for her expertise in cross-cultural and environmental conflict mediation and facilitation, multi-stakeholder design and planning, environmental justice, equitable development, brownfield redevelopment, urban river restoration, and community revitalization. Ms. Miller-Travis's interests have focused on environmental restoration and the inclusion of low-income, people of color, and indigenous communities in environmental decision-making at the federal, state, local, and tribal levels. She is so sought after that she has another engagement directly following this one, beginning at 7. So perhaps she will share something about that with us. Dennis Chestnut. He is a native Washingtonian and is a lifetime resident of Ward 7. Dennis is a master carpenter and vocational educator by profession, but his dedication to youth development, community improvement, and civic duty has led to his involvement with many civic and conservation projects and enriching experiences. He's also a lover of the outdoors, has a passion for conservation and the environment, and has advised many community, business, and government leaders on civic ecology and civic engagement issues. Last but not least, we have John Woods, who is the field director for the Earth Conservation Course. He spent 7 years going through 8 different ranks to become an Eagle Scout. Growing up, he always had a passion for nature and the environment. He started out as an AmeriCorps member during 900 hours from 2018 to 2019 before joining the ECC staff full-time. He's been a part of handling all the Raptors and Raptor programming for the last 2 years and was promoted to field director to begin leading all programming within the past year. He now cares for all of ECC's animals, takes care of both their buildings in DC, and hosts programs with various DC partners, including Youth Creative Change, Anacostia Riverkeepers, podcast groups, and various schools in the DC area. As you see, we have a well-rounded, thorough group of folks to join us tonight. I'm gonna ask all of them to turn on their cameras so we can all see their shining faces. And now that I've introduced them, I'm going to ask all of them to tell us a little bit about their work and where they're from, please. We'll start with Vernice, and then we'll go to Dennis and then John.
Thank you, Matt. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My background is I'm originally from Harlem, New York, born and raised, and spent some time in the South Bronx and middle school. And I'm the co-founder of a community-based environmental justice organization in New York called We Act for Environmental Justice. And last week, we celebrated our 33rd anniversary. So we've been at this for a minute. In terms of fighting for the interest of our community, but in fact, fighting for the interests of similarly situated communities all over the United States. And Dennis and I used to be a part of an organization called Groundwork USA. Dennis was the founding executive director of Groundwork Anacostia. And we have continued to do a lot of great work here in the DMV. I live in Prince George's County, Maryland, and Bowie, Maryland, where I've been for the last 23 years. And so I go back home to New York from time to time, but my home is in the DMV, and DC is the heart of my community life.
Thank you, Vernice. Dennis?
Yes, well, good evening to everyone. This is such an honor to have the opportunity to be on this panel and definitely to share time on this panel with not just a colleague, but a great friend in Vernice. She's even been a mentor to me in a lot of ways. So my name is Dennis Chestnut. I'm a native Washingtonian. I was born and raised right here in Washington, D.C., and I still live in the community where I grew up. I live in far northeast, Ward 7, which I consider one of the greenest areas in the city, being that we have so much, we have an abundance of green space, and this is the more natural end of the city. We are close to the Anacostia River, and one of the areas that I've spent a great deal of time in is Watts Branch, which is the largest tributary to the Anacostia River here in Washington, D.C. And as was stated, I've spent my time over the years focused on tangible on-the-ground projects to improve my community in various ways, but really focusing on improving the natural environment and including the residents and as the major stakeholder in that process, so that we could build the stewardship necessary to sustain it over time. I'm presently, as Vernice said, I'm a past retired executive director of Groundwork Anacostia River, DC, which was an organization I founded. Our work is still resonating, thank goodness. And I'm presently doing some work here in the community to build what we're calling a resilience hub.
Thank you, Dennis. John?
How you doing, everybody? As mentioned before, my name is John Wood. I'm the field director and raptor handler for the Earth Conservation Corps. So what that means is that raptor handler, I take care and maintain all the raptors and animals here at the Earth Conservation Corps: red-tailed hawk, Eurasian eagle owl, Harris hawk, and North American kestrel, as well as a red-eared slider named Tofu, but he's a turtle. So with these birds, they are our educational ambassadors. So we take them out, or people come to us, and I teach them on how these birds affect us, how we affect them, and what we can do to mitigate the effects on them, as well as other programs. I'm the field director, so I'm in charge of teaching other classes such as pollution classes, teaching like what's in our river, personally doing taking the trash out of the river with Anacostia Riverkeeper and AWS trash traps, doing 13-point sorts, so that way the data that can be found can be sent to DOEE, which creates laws such as the 5 cents a bag law, styrofoam ban, and other laws that would help bring money or information to the environmental fields. Of course, fishing programs, since we work directly on the Anacostia River at times, teaching about the invasive species, native species, and how they all coincide with each other, as well as green zone environmental projects that we teach on during summer as well, amongst many other things. So I'm glad that you guys have me aboard, and feel free to ask any questions when you need to.
Thanks so much, John, and everyone. We're so pleased to have you here. And so we'll ask that the three of you stay on camera for the rest of the time. That way, yeah, it'll go smoothly. And audience, thank you again for being here. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll collect those for the end of the program. Matt and I are gonna ask a handful of questions, and then we'd love to open it up to you. And yeah, we can keep the conversation going and alive in the chat box. So my first question for each of you is, how did you get involved, and how did your passion grow for environmental work, environmental justice? What's your origin story? And we can start with Dennis.
Sure. My origin story goes all the way back to my childhood and this community where I grew up. This part of the city was considered rural at one point. And the time period when I was a child, of course, we spent the majority of our time outdoors. That was just an everyday occurrence. And experiencing that, I got a chance to really be involved in nature, so to speak. I spent a lot of time in the streams down near the river. I actually learned how to swim in the Anacostia River, and had that kind of experience to give me a baseline for as I became an adult to really appreciate what I had as a youth, and realize the situations that existed, especially once I started raising a family and my children began to go into the same environment that I grew up in. So seeing some of the degradation, some of the ways that the places that I used to play and recreate and other kinds of things I really saw a need to get back involved. And fortunately, there were folks doing things. One of the early groups that I connected with was the Anacostia Watershed Society, who was looking for folks inside of the city to get involved with some of the work that they were doing. So the genesis of my involvement goes back to my youth, and I guess I was a steward as a young person, and my stewardship just grew as I aged in the process.
Great, thanks. And there's a great article that came out about your work and your origin story, and I'll drop that in the chat for people to read. John, what about you? How'd you get started in this?
All right, so well, as a child, I used to love fishing with my uncles and grandfather. So I was also in Boy Scouts, so that also introduced me a lot to the environment, you know, hiking, being able to actually go out and enjoy what you see out there, the insects, the birds, just like simple things that you can find out in nature that can bring a smile to your face while in Boy Scouts. But it all started majorly when I joined in as an AmeriCorps, sorry, it started off in 2017, I believe, when I was in 11th grade summer. I joined in the Earth Conservation Corps for building a 13-foot statue made out of bottles that we collected from the Anacostia River called Henson the Bottled Heron, named after Matthew Henson, one of the first Black explorers to go to the North Pole. So I kept in contact with the Earth Conservation Corps, and they were leading the AmeriCorps program in 2018. So I did 100 hours of that while learning more about the environment, the Anacostia River, the birds, amongst many other things. And I just kept with it.
I love it. We're so glad you have. Vernice, what about you?
Well, isn't that interesting that John talked about the Henson program? I went to PS 100 in Harlem, in elementary school, Matthew Henson Elementary School. And grew up in a school and an environment and in a community that was steeped in lifting up the African-American experience and the diaspora. My father was an immigrant from the Bahamas, and there were lots of West Indian immigrants in the Harlem community. When I grew up in Harlem in the 1960s, it had the largest concentration of people of African descent outside the continent of Africa. So everything was everywhere, and it was popping. It was popping politically, it was popping culturally. The Black Arts Movement was happening. One of the founding members of the Black Arts Movement was a wonderful artist named Faith Rango. She was also a public school teacher at PS 100. She was my art teacher from kindergarten to 5th grade. So she would take us to, to exhibits. She would take us to the village. She would take us everywhere and exposed us to everything. And she is still present. She's still alive. There's a retrospective coming up of her work and her life, but she really inspired me just to pay attention to what was going on around me. And you could not help but be touched by everything that was happening: the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the women's movement, the Black Arts movement, the young lords in walking distance from us in the South Bronx. It just was it was an incredible place to be. People were very poor to working class. There was a pocket of affluent Black folk, but we all lived together and we all struggled together and we all thrived together. But we also were impacted severely by environmental threats. And so I went to college at Barnard and Columbia University, which is also in Harlem. They call it a fictitious community called Morningside Heights. But Morningside Heights is a neighborhood in Harlem, no matter what they say. And when I finished college, I moved just a little bit north of campus into West Harlem. And there, that community was engaged in a massive struggle against the city of New York and the state of New York and the Environmental Protection Agency for siting a massive sewage treatment plant on our Hudson River waterfront, which transformed our community and turned us into a giant toilet bowl. So it treated all the raw sewage and wastewater from the entire west side of Manhattan, from the southernmost end of Manhattan to the northernmost end of Manhattan. Everybody's toilets, everybody's drains, every street drained into this sewage treatment plant in our community, which was built without the benefit of any odor control devices. So 180 million gallons of raw sewage and wastewater a day going tepid and reverting to a natural system. At the time when this plant first went online in 1986, they were using an oxygen system where they would introduce into these big holding tanks, these just millions of gallons of raw sewage and wastewater would come in, and they would introduce oxygen, and the oxygen would eat its way through that sludge and that sewage, and then they would develop an effluent, and then that effluent would be trucked out to the Fresh Kills landfill in Staten Island, another county in New York City, or put back into the Hudson River. So, but we had no odor control devices, and the plant was exactly at the same level as our apartment buildings. And so 100,000 people lived in this community, and 100,000 people were forced to smell raw sewage, millions of gallons of it every day for many, many, many years, until we successfully sued the city of New York and got them to spend $55 million to fix that sewage treatment plant and pay our community-based organization $1.1 million. And it was at that point, we had been organizing for 8 years, and it was at that point that we were first able to hire staff and to really begin to build an organization. And that was 33 years ago. So I also was a researcher on a major project, but what was going on in my community was really the thing that, that springboarded me to making this my life's work.
Thank you, Vernice. Thank you, John. Thank you, Dennis. I too moved here from New York, and a quick, very funny story. When we moved here from New York, there was a brother who helped us move, and in the alley right outside this window, he looked around. And, I'm in Northeast, near Franklin, near 4th and Franklin. He looked around and he said, "Is everything over here that's rural?" So as a matter of perspective, Dennis, I love how you saying that Ward 7 was thought of as rural, and from New York's myopic view, Ward 5 is apparently still thought of as rural. Vernice, thank you for sharing all you just shared and naming that 33 years in this. Over that 33 years, for some of that time, for a long part of that early time, environmental issues were largely, from the perspective of the movement, they were considered white issues. And Vernice, I'm asking if you can talk about that a little bit, and how the principles of environmental justice emerged from the connections between race and the environment, and the role of the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit Conference.
Sure. Well, it's always interesting when I hear people, wax poetically about the environmental movement. They are not talking about the work that communities of color are doing. They're talking about this massive gathering that was held in New York Central Park. The northern part of Central Park is also in Harlem, but they could have been having that conference in that gathering in Alaska, and apparently it was 100,000 people at that gathering in Central Park. But you would not have known that in Harlem, because nobody came to the northern end of the park, which most people never actually came to, because there were Black and brown people that lived around that part of the park. But there was no engagement with us. It's like when people come to DC, right, Dennis, and all kinds of gatherings and efforts come here, you would think there were no people that lived in DC, because they never do any outreach and talk about, well, how are we going to do mass mobilization with the people in the District of Columbia? Well, the same was true for everything that's ever been had in Central Park. It's like Harlem doesn't exist. So, we went on about our lives and focusing on the things that we were focusing on, and, we're not really aware of or a part of this burgeoning national and global conversation about environmentalism. But that movement that most people are familiar with was a movement about conservation. And conservation is a great thing. John works on conservation all the time, conservation of species, conservation of, wildlife. We're living in a moment now where we're facing the 6th great mass extinction of species from the planet Earth. It is an incredibly important thing. But the work that I was focused on, and the work that came to be really important to me, was the preservation of the species of Black people, of Black and brown people, who were also disappearing off the face of this earth, largely from environmental threats. or environmental threats that were happening every day, but they were of no consequence to anyone. So, so lots of communities. We thought it was just our community. We thought that there was no one else that was as impacted by environmental issues, in our case, air pollution. We thought we were singular in that effort. And I, as I said, when I met my neighbors and friends in the community who were doing this environmental organizing, I was also working at the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice and working on this report, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. And so I was looking at the location of hazardous waste sites around the United States. Where were these waste sites located? What residential zip codes were they in? And what was the racial composition of the residential zip codes in which they were located? And we ran data set after data set. I was in charge of tabulating that data and creating the maps by hand. And we found that race proved to be the most statistically significant indicator in where those sites were located. And then I met up with my neighbors 2/3 of the way through this research. And I was struck within 20 minutes of meeting these folks at a community meeting. Oh my goodness, the very thing that I'm looking at in other people's communities all over the country is happening in my own front yard. It's happening right where I live. It's affecting my mother and my family and my neighbors. So the United Church of Christ put out this report. It started a national conversation, and about 4 years later, a wonderful guy named Charles Lee, who was the research director at the Commission for Racial Justice and now a senior advisor for environmental justice at the Environmental Protection Agency, Charles had the idea that maybe we needed to pull people together to have a national conversation about what was going on. And so Charles put out the call, and United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice put out the call, and hundreds and hundreds, 700 people showed up at the Washington Court Hotel on New Jersey Avenue Northwest, just down the street from the Capitol, literally walking distance from the Capitol. And I remember walking into that space with my colleague, Peggy Shepard, who's the co-founder of We Act for Environmental Justice, along with me, and our executive director. And I remember walking, we did the registration, and then we walked into the ballroom, and there were already hundreds of people there. And I remember grabbing Peggy's hand and just being so overcome because we were not the only people. And we literally thought we were the only people who were facing this. And so that alone was just such a powerful, powerful, powerful thing that even though we were all up against it, being up against it standing together is different than being up against it standing by yourself, right? And one of the things that happened in that conference was that we were tasked, the drafting committee on which I served was tasked to write this document, the Principles of Environmental Justice. And so the conference was going on in the main ballroom, and we were in a little ante room right off the main ballroom. So I like to say I was there, but I wasn't there. I had a task, and I was assigned to that task for 3 days, me and about 14 or 15 other people. And every night we would come out we would have lunch, and we'd go back to our task. People would be in work groups and sessions and, talks and cultural presentations. And after dinner every night, we would present to the body, 700 people, what we had drafted that day. And then they would debate every freaking word that we had written, right? And I was like, really, y'all? Is this what we're going to do? And yes, that was what we were going to do. And they were not having it. If you were trying to truncate that process, they were not having it. And I remember at one point, I think this was at some point on Saturday night, we had gotten there on Thursday. And so, we've been hashing this out for 2 days. And so we're presenting the fifth iteration to the audience. And a dear friend of mine, Leah Wise, who was with an organization called Black Workers for Social Justice out of Durham, North Carolina, I said to the audience, okay, let's not wordsmith this, right? Let's get our main principles down and our main thinking and the things that we want to put out in the world, but we'll have an opportunity to come back and relook at this again and again and again. And Leah stood up and Leah said, no, we won't. We're not coming back to do this again. This is it. So we need to say, it's like the Magna Carta, right? We need to say whatever it is we're going to say, because we ain't coming back and doing this again. And I need to tell you, much to my chagrin, Leah was right, because the one thing I really want to do for the principals is go back and fix the damn grammar, right? So I'm the kind of person that I like every dot and every tittle to be, but people wanted it literal, what they said. And I'm like, but that word and that word don't agree with each other. We don't care, Vernice. That's what we want, right? And so that's what's in there. It's fairly good, but it has stood the test of time. For 30 years, it has been the thing that we have stood on as a social movement. And I'm always struck by young people who are coming into the movement or coming into the work and who have never heard of the principles of environmental justice. And so I said, that's where it starts and that's where it ends. And you can build anything you want on that foundation, but that's the foundation.
So great. Thank you so much. And I want to add a little story before we move to Dennis. I was at Eaton Hotel on KN12 last week or the week before, and the People versus Fossil Fuel protest was in town. A bunch of indigenous, mostly youth,
Yes.
fighting the Pipeline 3, but all kinds of different climate issues. And one evening in the middle of the week of this week of action, they gathered for pizza and just kind of camaraderie and went around the circle and shared the fight that they're working on in Texas, on the border, in Alaska, in California, here in DC, just all over. And what you said, Vernice, around like just knowing that you're not alone, like the fight is hard when you're doing it, but to be in a group of people who are also doing that fight is so encouraging and so enriching, and it allows you to go home and continue the fight. And that's exactly the sentiment that they were sharing in that space, was like, it's just so good to not be alone and to know that you exist. Like, we may never see each other again, but you're here.
Yep.
So thank you for sharing that. And I think it's a good reminder to all of us just how important community is, even if they're far away. We're in this together. So Dennis, environmental justice, this phrase, these principles, what did the principles mean to you when you first encountered them? And where were you in your journey when you encountered them?
Well, environmental justice, to me, a lot of times, really hits the point that of the lived experience that I had. And, it was early on when, and I have to go back, as I said, I grew up in this community, and I need to describe a little bit of how this community was, back in the 50s and 60s, really up into the 1970s. This is a community. First of all, as I say, the city has 8 wards. Washington, D.C. is broken down into 8 wards. And 2 of those wards are located on the east side of the Anacostia River. And those 2 wards just so happen to be the wards that the majority population in those wards are, people of color, Black people, Asian, Latino, you name it. So it really was the most diverse part of the city, primarily because of the restrictive covenants that existed in the other parts of the cities, where Black people and other what they call minorities were relegated to live east of the river, and especially in far northeast Ward 7. This is an area where the city's landfill existed. So what is now Kenilworth Park was a landfill. That was the dump. The area where I was saying, I learned how to swim in the Anacostia River, but we had to navigate our way to the river by way of Watts Branch. We had to navigate our way through the landfill to get to the river. Also, right on the edge of that same landfill is the PEPCO, the Potomac Electric Power Company power plant. And so at one point, that power plant was fueled by burning coal. As a matter of fact, the house I grew up in, our heat was also a coal-fired furnace. And so this just speaks to the kind of conditions that the community was relegated to, and we had to adapt and survive it in the ways that we did. So, the principles of environmental justice really hit home to me because, I can remember the women who were a part of the auxiliary over in the Eastland Gardens community. They had a garden club over there, but these women were fierce, and they would protest the trucks that would be bringing the debris. And when I say the debris, you think about it. Some folks, Bernice was talking about the how the debris was shipped to the landfill outside of her community. Well, all of the debris of whatever you name it was shipped to my community. The railroad tracks ran through this community, so the coal cars that took the coal to the power plant, was right here in the neighborhood where I grew up in. So this was the lived experience, and I can remember the times that my parents, like for example, my mother. I mean, they hand washed their laundry and all the laundry and hung it out on the line to dry. But trying to be aware of when those burn days, and what I mean burn days, what they used to do was to move all of that debris up into piles inside of that dump, inside of that landfill, and they would burn it. And on those burn days, that smoke and debris and soot from the burning would saturate this entire area. I mean, if you're not familiar with from River Terrace to Langston Terrace to all of the communities that were in proximity of that power plant. And think about in those days, we didn't have air conditioning. I mean, there was not air conditioning. So people had screens up to their windows and doors, and that was the only thing that was between that polluted air that existed and the home, inside of the home. There's been a large percentage of people who contracted various kinds of cancers and respiratory ailments. I remember classmates of mine when I was in elementary and junior high, before I even really knew what asthma was. But there were young people who were asthmatic, and a lot of it was a result of the conditions that we were relegated to live in. So when the principles of environmental justice, became apparent to me, they rang true to what the lived experience for me and for my family and for my community, what it was. And it was very easy for me to grab hold to and make it a part of the work that I was going to be engaged in. I'm a trained builder. I'm a carpenter by trade, and I got an opportunity to to work outside, along with the fact that I grew up in the outdoors, spending a lot of time there. But I really began to gain an appreciation for how things were done, and that also made me look at the community again where I lived. And so environmental justice is, I would call it environmental injustice when it comes to how our communities were treated over time. And just to put a cap on it, the landfill was closed down in 1970. It was closed down as a result of a young child. It could have very easily been me, because we all used to spend time playing in the landfill. That was our recreation. We didn't have recreation centers in my community at that time. And this young man, his name was Kelvin Mock. I always like to, give him kudos just to say his name, because Kelvin Mock died and perished in one of those fires. he got caught up in there and didn't make it out. And that was really kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. As I said, those women from the garden club used to even lay across the roadway to as protests to stop those trucks from bringing that debris into that landfill. And so when Kevin Mock perished in the fires, they finally shut down the dump, the landfill, and did a cap and turned it in what they called a park. But what they did was they just shifted the burning from the landfill to an incinerator that was located right beside the power plant. So now you had the power plant burning coal, and you have this massive incinerator with these smokestacks burning all of this trash and debris of all kind. I mean, hospital waste, whatever, you name it. It was being burned in that incinerator. So in 2012, well, really in 2011, we successfully got the power plant shut down from actually producing power. It's only a transmission facility now, but we got the stacks that were one time spewing polluted pollution into the community. We got those torn down, and we're working to actually now do a full retrofit of the landfill into a area that fortunately, well, hopefully will be able to be a asset in the community. But environmental justice or environmental injustice is something that was a lived experience for me. And I grabbed hold to those principles and began to incorporate it into the work that I did once I became an adult.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Vernice. We've been talking about the principles of environmental justice, and we've kind of been doing that like everybody knows what they are. Katrina posted them in the chat, and so I'm just posting them again so that everybody can see them in case anybody here hasn't seen them. You can click on the link, and like Vernice said, they have stood the test of time for 30 years, despite whatever grammar is present in the in the principles themselves. And we sitting here with the, you know, with the I say sacrificial author of the principles themselves. And I say sacrificial because you write it and the people determine whatever it's going to be. And Dennis here has said that they were really important to him. John, I'm wondering if you could speak to how you see your work in relationship to how Vernice and Dennis have described their work and the way they've described environmental justice.
All right, so what we tried to teach about and also give to the people is that, especially the Anacostia River, which we're located on, is that this is their river. Like, it's been polluted, dumped in, and basically mistreated because, you know, of the people that live there. Not saying that they did it. Of course, you know, everybody has played a part a little bit at least, but we can also do our part in trying to fix it together. However, it's not unnoticeable that the Black communities or low income communities are mostly affected by pollution, dumping, and basically neglect. In a lot of areas that are more high income, you'll see more trees, you'll see more rain gardens, permeable surfaces, while places like Syfax Garden, you really won't see that. Like the rest of this, especially around Navy Yard, has been built up. Basically, people with high income or people who are not really from DC end up taking the homes that people in DC are living in, especially like Berry Farms was another example. But we basically try to teach people or encourage people to help clean up their river or take back their communities, like what our mission was back in 1992 and to this day. Take back the communities from the pollution and drugs and problems that have been basically put into this, your land or your family's life. So being more specific, as I mentioned earlier, we use our raptors to as indicators of our environment. So we use them to like kind of coincide with how they are like us or how they are like the colored people or low income communities. because, you know, there are so many different things that get rid of them: pollution, poisons. Poisons for us would be all the different chemicals that we release from our cars, our plastics, construction, especially right now. There's so much construction going on right now. And from what I've seen, like, not a lot of it is like contained when it comes to like the trash and debris that gets left over. To this day, like, you'll still see cars and trucks like just like with the lids off, you know, dust flying around. And then I'm not sure what exactly they're doing over there when I see all the trash and booms like right behind the river or right behind the construction sites on the river. So basically, telling people and also encouraging people that, also showing them that the effects of pollution have on them as well as the animals around them, and how it is proportionally affecting in low income or colored communities. Things such as the fish inside of our river, to this day, that there are 70% of blue catfish, which are invasive species, which were brought over for profit basically. And no one or not a lot of people were taking care of that problem, as well as the actual cancer that the fish have now in here too. We've been doing programs where we teach people like what they can actually do in this river, such as fishing, like catch and release. And during these programs, we've taught people and also showed them that, hey, this trash isn't just, you know, they're not just being eaten, but also affecting the skin and the health of these fish. You have fish that have inflated organs, ovaries are messed up, cancer sores, parasites, like we've seen it all recently. And I do mean recently within the past month. So, but going back to how we, as the Earth Conservation Corps, and what I do, deal with environmental injustices and racism. We also try to teach our youth of the different jobs that, you know, it's not just for people who are Caucasian or basically or high income, that these jobs can be done for Black people or people of low income, such as the job that I'm in right now. Like, I'm the field director and raptor handler, teaching people from Washington, D.C., Ward 678, and basically all over DMV area about how we are affected by the pollution, how we can help, what we can do to mitigate our problems, and what we can do to basically take back the communities away from the pollution and people who would want to do us harm. There is also more, of course, green zone environmental projects. We teach kids as well as adults with, well, GZEP, green zone environmental projects, on how rain gardens and other bayscapes and other projects can be done to help bring back life to their environment, such as the rain gardens. We've actually created a couple of bayscapes and rain gardens around Sapphics Garden, and there was also 2 of them around Ballou High School. I am sorry, I'm drawing a blank on what exactly the rec center it was called that we did them on, but basically to teach and also give people the skills that they need in order to take back the communities.
Great. Thank you, John. I'm so glad that you're able to do that work and pass it on to even younger generations with the programs you do with young people. So this is the 30th anniversary of the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, for which the principles of environmental justice emerged, as Vernice talked about. Vernice, from a national level, what has changed in this period? So 30 years, a lot's happened. Can you talk to us a little bit about the wins or just where we're at?
Well, the first thing that happened, we came out of the summit and we decided we didn't want to parrot what was happening in the mainstream environmental and conservation movement. We wanted to build a social movement that we felt stood on the shoulders of the civil rights movement and the various many liberation movements, you know, in the US and in the hemisphere, and that we wanted to build a social movement that was really rooted in people and in communities. And so the easier thing to do would have been to establish a national organization. And we decided we didn't want to do that. We tasked everybody to go back home and to organize in their own communities and their own regions. So out of that grew organizations like the Indigenous Environmental Network, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, the Southwest Network for Economic and Environmental Justice. Some years later would come the National Black Environmental Justice Network. An old line civil rights organization, the Southern Organizing Committee, became an organization that focused on environmental injustice in the Deep South. And we went home and we organized and we built community and we built community-based organizations, but we intentionally did not establish a singular national organization. And that has proved very perplexing for lots of people, including state agencies and the federal government, who like having a group of, mostly white folk that they can talk to, all fit in one room and make some decisions about what's going to happen. Our movement isn't like that. Our movement is diffuse. Our movement is everywhere. Everywhere that people of color live in these United States, there are people working on environmental justice issues. And they've built organizations. Some of those organizations have been around for a very long time. The Environmental Health Coalition in San Diego is over 40 years old. The People for Community Recovery in Chicago was established in 1979. The Southwest Organizing Project in Albuquerque was established in 1980. We started our organizing in West Harlem in 85, but we established our nonprofit in 1988. And lots of tribal communities have been at this for a very long time. Dennis mentioned a struggle in his community that really was going on in the 1960s and 70s. And in our community, people had been throwing down to keep the North River Sewage Treatment Plant from being sited in our backyard since 1968. I was 9 when they started that struggle. And when I joined it, I was 27. And people kept that mobilization going on all that time. Now, one thing that hasn't happened is the resource or the philanthropic support. The foundations love environmental stuff. As long as you ain't talking about race and environment, they love it. And so we started to see coming out of the summit, some of the big environmental organizations were beginning to address or, beginning to at least say environmental justice, a set of issues that they had not seen or had intentionally looked past. And so I went to work at the Natural Resources Defense Council as the first director of environmental justice there. An incredible brother, originally from St. Louis, but lived in DC for a very long time, Damu Smith, became an organizer for Greenpeace and then the Southeast Regional Director for Greenpeace. And a sister named Dion Ferris, who came here from Cleveland to go to Georgetown Law School. Dion worked at the National Wildlife Federation, but you could count the people of color on one hand that worked at the big environmental organizations. And so fortunately, most of us had our feet firmly planted in the movement for environmental justice, even if we were other places. And so we began to see policy articulated. After the summit, President Clinton in 1994 signed the Executive Order on Environmental Justice 12898, the first time that we had ever seen any movement at the federal level to really begin to look government-wide at what federal agencies were doing or what they should and could be doing to protect these communities. We saw some civil rights organizations begin to join forces with us and recognize that environmental racism was real and it was a civil rights issue. And as far as we're concerned, it's the civil rights issue of the 20th and the 21st century. We don't always get a lot of support from folk in the civil rights movement, but we see more and more happening, right? And then we just saw this explosion of organizations. We also saw an effort to professionalize the work, right? So there's really grassroots rooted social justice, social movement. And then there are folks who are also doing this professionally. I happen to be one of those people who are doing both things. But if you were to ask me what means the most to me, it's the work that's going on in my community at home and the work that's going on in communities across the country. So we began to see the proliferation of a lot of public policy. We began to see environmental justice really integrated into federal policy and federal policy articulation because we were at the table. We saw the EPA establish the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, the Federal Advisory Committee, to advise the agency and the administrator of EPA on all things environmental justice. We saw state agencies begin to take up the issue. So a lot of lip service was paid to EJ, but if you were to ask, Katie, as you did, what has profoundly changed? Well, the air quality in our community is profoundly different. We had the highest rate and incidence of asthma in our community in the United States. We had the highest level of fine particle pollution exposure of any community in the United States. We had the highest rate of death, premature death from asthma of any community in the United States. That is not our narrative anymore. Because we fought that, we pushed that back, and so many communities have had victories like that. But I wish I could say, Katie, that we can look back and say, wow, that's not our narrative anymore, but it is our narrative, right? We still live with the legacy of transportation planning and transportation systems that have dissected and bisected, and in some places devastated and erased our communities. What Dennis talked about in terms of all of the environmental threats that were where he lived, that is true for every community of color in these United States. Everything that people don't want to live next to is where we live. But we have been successful in raising the issue and putting it not just on the national landscape, but on the international landscape. So there's a global movement for environmental justice, and we help to bring that global conversation into existence by going into some of these international UN fora. The UN Conference on Environment and Development, the Earth Summit in 1992, we had a delegation of EJ folks from the US who went to that conference for the first time. The Istanbul Conference on Sustainable Communities, we had an EJ delegation there. The UN World Conference Against Racism, we had a delegation there. The UN World Summit on Sustainable Development, and every one of the 26 conference of the parties around climate change. There have been EJ folks from the US and all over the world have been present and organizing in those conferences to raise these issues to a national level. I should also say that some foundations have stepped up. I had the privilege of working at the Ford Foundation as the first program officer for environmental justice at the Ford Foundation, and my job was to grow the grassroots environmental justice movement. That was my job, right? And I loved that job, but I have to tell you, I thought $4 million, giving away $4 million a year before I got to the foundation, I thought we were going to change the world. And then after I got to the foundation, I realized, damn, $4 million is not a lot of money when people are throwing down in all 50 states, all territories, right? Everywhere that we are, in the Marshall Islands, in the South Pacific, in Puerto Rico, in the US Virgin Islands, along the US-Mexico border, everywhere we are, in the Arctic Circle, in Alaska, the Inuit are throwing down over these issues. And so I can't say, Katie, that we have eradicated the problem, because the problem is so deep and generations long, but we certainly have changed the conversation about what is environmentalism, right? What is the environment? That we say the environment is where we live, where we work, where we worship, where we recreate, where we go to school. In other words, the environment is everywhere. It's not the thing that you go to see in the national park. It's not the thing that you go to see at the river's edge. The environment is right where we are. Wherever we are, that's where the environment is. And so we've changed that conversation and changed the public discourse, changed the global discourse. And you can see that in President Biden, right? And the way he just came out swinging on day one, his first afternoon in office. He was inaugurated on the morning of the 20th of January. On the afternoon of the 20th of January, he signed Executive Order 13985 to address systemic racism and environmental injustice, right? And he signed so many others since then. We are at the table. Now the question is, do we have the political will as a nation to really eradicate and speak to these issues like Dennis's community, my community, and so many others? And do we have the political will in the global conversation to meet this moment? And so my fingers are crossed, Katie. My fire is lit, but I don't know that I trust everybody to be as committed to racial justice, social justice, and environmental justice. But that's never stopped us before.
Thank you, Vernice. If we don't develop that will, as you alluded to earlier, we're about to face that sixth major extinction. And so, it's on us at this point. Vernice, thank you for that very sweeping, description of how things have changed at both the national and international level. Dennis, I wonder if you might speak to how things have changed here at the local level in DC since the emergence of the principles of environmental justice.
Well, sure. And I'm glad Vernice mentioned about being at the table, because there's a saying that I like to quote from time to time: if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
That's right.
So it's very important, and this is something that I really like to push out, especially to our younger people, but really to everyone. We have to be at the table. We can't hand over to other people the ability to make those kinds of decisions that will have impact and affect, all of our lives, especially the lives of our communities and our the people who live in those communities. But a lot has changed. Starting right here in Washington, D.C. That time period that I was describing, Washington, D.C. was 100% controlled by the federal government. There was no elected representation here in Washington, D.C. I mean, we've come a long way. We still are a colony, I call it. I say we're the last colony because there are congressmen and senators who, when the people who Washington, D.C. have elected to represent us, and we pay more federal tax money than at least a dozen other states. But before our budget, which is our money, is approved, it has to go before Congress for Congress to say, put the stamp of approval on how we spend the money that we pay in taxes. So I really wanted to make that point that DC is still the last colony, and we're working on statehood, and statehood is absolutely necessary for a number of reasons, so that we can actually have autonomy to make the laws that affect us every day, but also make the kind of decisions that will impact the lives of the rest of the country. But a lot of things have changed. We now have, and I like to give credit to one of, I think, the best agencies here in Washington, D.C. That's the Department of Energy and Environment. That's an agency that is still relatively young. That agency came about in the early 2000s. And it was actually all of the things associated with the environment, if you want to call it that, were housed within the Department of Health prior to the Department of Energy and Environment coming online. And another thing that has happened now, I mean, it's not all doom and gloom. We have made some tremendous progress on the cleanup of the Anacostia River. And I'm here to say that I remember when at one point, the word has been for a very long time. We've been saying we want to have that river fishable and swimmable. And even though I did swim in it when I was a kid, and survived that, but we want that river to be fishable and swimmable. Well, initially, the projections were having that done by the year 2032, which we rejected and pushed back very hard against. We felt that was just an opportunity for, those folks responsible for various things within the government to just kind of kick the can down the road and allow someone else to kick it down the road further. So we pushed and got that target date, and this was over a decade ago, to 2025. And I can truly say that we have made tremendous progress, and we do have days right now where the river is swimmable in various locations. And I strongly feel that the river will be swimmable by 2025, which is a tremendous accomplishment in itself. Now, we're not there. We still have a ways to go, but that's a tremendous accomplishment. Another thing is, I'm very excited about seeing things like now in our city school system, they have environmental literacy as part of graduation requirements, which is a tremendous accomplishment. That means that the young people who are coming through the education system now at least are being exposed to environmental principles, beginning to understand why it's important and why these things are necessary to do. Because the whole key to this work is really understanding. And once you understand a thing, you'll have more of a tendency to take action, and that's a very critical and important thing to take place. A number of other things have happened. I mean, it's a whole laundry list of things. I mean, even though we have the tremendous building boom underway here in the city, we've gotten green building standards passed, so that it goes to everything from stormwater management to requiring buildings that are not able to meet certain stormwater management and green building requirements to have to pay into having green infrastructure installed in other parts of the city where it would be beneficial to those communities. It's just a number of things that are taking place now that have been the result of a lot of hard work on the local level and pushing and holding accountable our elected leaders and others to really go ahead and do the things that need to be done. We still need to have an opportunity to engage the local community more in this work. If the community is not involved, then they'll be overlooked. It's kind of like that saying, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. Well, if we sit back and are complacent and just take for granted that someone else is going to take care of things, then we'll continue to be overlooked and left in the kind of conditions that exist. This community where I live and where I do most of the work that I'm engaged in right now, even though I'm retired from actual work, and I love retirement. I recommend it for everybody. But retirement doesn't mean you retire from doing the work. So this area sits in what is called the floodplain, and most of the 85% of the homes that are located in the ward where I live, 85% of those homes sit within this floodplain, the 100-year floodplain. We still experience flooding, and I can definitely say that a lot of the flooding is a result of how things were built. We didn't experience flooding over here in the neighborhood where I live until the highway was constructed that came through Route 295, for those who know, in 1957 when that was completed. It just pushed stormwater right into the neighborhoods and the communities over here east of the river, especially here in Ward 7. And so a lot of the kinds of things that we have to tackle and address, are still existing. But I can say we've come a long way. We have a lot more tools to work with. And it's very important that we outreach and engage the wider community to get involved with this work so that we can do the kind of things that's going to make the difference in improving the quality of life for the residents throughout the city. Some other things that have been accomplished over time that locally here is we have some we have a number of grassroots organizations. I call them those community serving organizations that really take a lot of weight off of the government as far as the things that they take care of and do. These are the organizations that are that work the closest with the on the ground work right within the community with residents. All of it's not quote unquote environmental, but these organizations do important work, mutual aid work, and other kinds of things that make the difference in the quality of life for the residents here. Well, one of the things that has happened is a coalition of those organizations have been formed. It's called the Anacostia Park and Community Collaborative. And there are probably at least 30 of these grassroots organizations that are members of this. And this has brought in organizations that traditionally didn't even consider themselves doing anything related to environment or environmental justice. But their level of stewardship has been raised by being involved. And now we are able to reach further into the community and engage more parts of the community and really make some of the kind of improvements that are going to be important for us going forward. So as I said, we have a long way to go. We have a lot of work to still do, but through efforts, tangible, on the ground efforts by local folks, and and like I said, pushing those who are responsible for making sure that those resources reach out into the areas where we live. I can say that we've actually made some great growth and progress.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you very much. One of the things that knowing our past, creating our future has really emphasized is intergenerational dialogue. And part of that comes out of a commitment to building movements and a belief rooted in Katie and I's experience, the conversations between generations mean that young folks mean that they ain't got to, recreate the wheel, or, the people who are young ain't the first person who have ever done this. But in fact, in gathering multiple generations, we've got to learn from each other. We've been able to learn from each other. And so, John, I wonder, because you enter your work and the world after Vernice and Dennis, I wonder if you might speak to one, how the changes they describe sit with you, if how you see them, if that resonates with your reality, and also to follow up on something that Dennis said. He had said, that community engagement has increased dramatically, though we still have a whole bunch to do. And I wonder if you might talk to some of the ways that your work in the Earth Conservation Corps is doing some of that engagement as a way to share knowledge of it.
Oh, sorry. So first things first, like how the Earth Conservation Corps and I spread out more engagement. As I mentioned before, we work with different organizations and programs in order to work with our families and youth of the communities, be it in DC or Maryland or Virginia. We want it all, or to spread out the information to all. During the fishing events, as I mentioned earlier, we not only just do the fishing, but we also tell the history of the Anacostia River and try to encourage people to hey, if you're ever in this area, hey, you can either, clean up or just don't add on to the problem. If you see someone or your family, throwing away trash or using pollutants or let's say a pesticides on their gardens and things, try to convince them or learn, take from what we taught you, hey, there are different options, that there are things that you can do so that way you don't have to add on to the problem, or help out a little sometimes. And then with the trash trap cleanup, Dennis, I remember you mentioned AWS, or Anacostia Watershed Society. So we actually work with them. We maintain one of the last remaining wetland strips here in Washington, D.C. The rest of it, or most of the Anacostia River, has been seawalled off. So we take volunteers out from the DMV area, or There's also this podcast group called Nice to Meet You podcast that we've been working with monthly to take out trash within the Anacostia River and the wetland, as well as working with our youth from different schools. Recently, within the past 2 weeks, I did a class with 15 students and 3 teachers in which we went to the river and we collected over 200 pounds of trash. And then we also did an actual sort of that trash, teaching them like, hey, this is what's in the river, this is what we have in here, and what can we do to, get rid of this problem? Because a lot of times what they find is styrofoam, plastic bottles, food wrappers, like, so this is all things that we can see and that we can mitigate. Um, as well as I mentioned with the raptors, we teach how they affect us, how we affect them, but most importantly, we try to tie in like how they are indicators of our environments, like our communities. Like if we don't see them here, then that's a problem. If we don't see these red-tailed hawks, and that means that either something down below in the system, such as no more food for them, like the rodents, those are gone, or if there are people, I believe it was during the 50s or in the 1900s, people had started using a lot more pesticides, especially DDT, I believe it was called, which messed up the eagle eggs and also the other animal eggs, which caused them to become more brittle. So we teach people like, hey, like these things in the past, like they have happened, and let's make sure that we don't, do them again. Also, so going back to what Dennis and Vernice said about how these things have changed, specifically the Anacostia River, it has gotten better. Like there is a noticeable change in the river. There are actually fish, there are eagles, there are ospreys. It used to be so that way eagles were basically gone. Like there was no fish in here that they can edibly eat. Like everything was poisonous. Even to this day, people cannot eat the fish in here over a certain amount. Like it's very, very much said that you should not eat over a certain amount or else you can get sick, especially for pregnant women. But things have changed. More people have been, actually caring about the river. We have different organizations that work with us, as well as I mentioned, like just people in the community that actually, when we are doing the trash traps ourselves, like they come to us, they ask for help, they even sign up themselves to do these different projects during the weekends. So that's like morally, I believe people have been changing to a better side of like saying, hey, we need to get this done. Like it's a problem that we all are facing. Like we may not know like all of the risks and problems that are happening, but we know that it's still causing a problem. So the change of heart in people is definitely noticeable. And then Vernice, as you said, with the trash being in, like you mentioned that all the sewage and dumping of the trash was going into Harlem in like one space. To this day, I believe we only have 3 trash transfer stations. So, and one of those, well, basically all of them are near low-income communities. Specifically, one of them I'm mentioning is called Fort Totten Trash Transfer Station, which is actually by Tacoma Park. So what we also try to teach people is, like, yes, you have to get rid of your trash. Like everybody makes trash. What we can do is try to mitigate how much you put out or what you put out. For instance, during the trash traps, one of the things that we collect or sort out is trash bags, plastic grocery bags and water bottles. So we try to teach, and trust me, there are a lot of water bottles. So what we try to teach people is, hey, or convince people is, hey, don't use these type of water bottles. Like, yes, if you have to, then use them. But if you can, try to use renewable sources or reusable bottles. So that way they don't have to, keep on buying a new one, dumping these, throwing away these old ones, because not all, your trash doesn't always go to the right places. Sometimes it goes to the landfill, sometimes it goes out onto your streets. Stormwater runoff causes it to go into the river and our forests and also our nature areas, which is another thing that we speak on as well, or try to convince people to have more permeable surfaces in their area, so that way stormwater runoff is less of a problem when it comes to getting pollutants to their homes and also their river. As well as the other programs that we do. We have done programs where we actually talked about environmental injustices and racism, specifically talking, especially a point that I'm pretty sure everybody knows of, like the water systems, not everybody is able to get clean water. DC, there are certain areas that, water quality is much different than others. And I'm pretty sure everybody has already heard of Flint, and the major problems that they have had to face when it comes to their water being polluted and not being taken care of. So we try to tell people that, also convince people like, hey, like this river is a clean, or used to be a clean source of water. It was once a river called the River of Healing Waters, so clear that you can see like straight at the bottom. However, due to pollution, dumping, and basically neglect, we no longer can use it as a source to use as food and drinking water, because dumping and also the stormwater runoff brings in all the trash that that hasn't been properly put away.
John, I so appreciate all the work that you're doing to educate folks in DC and get people excited to contribute and be a part of the solution. I think it's so important. And just like your voice and your passion will carry on the legacy of the summit 30 years ago and all the work that's come before and after. So yeah, really appreciate you. I want to move to questions from the audience. We have a couple, and if there are more that come through the chat, we can ask those. And I want to shout out Janelle and Katrina for putting together basically a college course in the chat box. So I really hope we can get the transcript to this chat box, because people can pore over it for many weeks and months into the future. And those who are listening on Facebook and the recording, yeah, you're missing out on the Zoom chat right now, because thanks, Katrina. And we'll try and find ways. Janelle's pushing it all to Facebook, so that's perfect. So you're going to have it in that thread. Great. So I want to move to the first question from the audience. And Allison says, to Vernice's comments about the deliberation to get to the 17 principles, are there particular lessons you pull from that for us to learn about process, collaboration, and decision among and between communities? I love this. This is such an organizing question. This is so much of our work.
I love that question. That you empower people by working together to work through whatever the process is collectively and collaboratively, with no one was in charge. I mean, we were facilitating the folks who were on the drafting committee. We were facilitating the conversation, but we were not in charge of the conversation. The conversation belonged to all of us. And we were not leaving until we had a document that reflected what everyone wanted to say. And that has stayed with me from then until now. And any process that I'm in, and any facilitation that I'm doing, and I facilitate a lot of dialogues and a lot of conversations and a lot of conflict. I do a lot of, I'm a certified environmental conflict mediator, particularly where issues of race and class and environment are present. I facilitate a lot of dialogues around the country. And I know that you have to create a process that people see themselves in, that they're part of that process. And then whatever decision-making that comes out of that, that decision-making reflects the will of the body. It reflects everyone's interest. And when you can set the table so that can happen, that's when people move forward and people take ownership. And, and both John and Dennis have talked about people having a role in decision-making. John has talked about teaching young folk, how to understand and care about the place where they live and the environment around them. People will hold on to that for the rest of their lives if they have the ability to be in a process where their thinking, their recommendations, their thoughts, their questions are valued and answered and not dismissed. And so that's, I keep that with me all the time. And I remember when we were first organizing in our own community in New York around the sewage treatment plant, the overwhelming smell of raw sewage was permeating our homes. And that's what we sued the city of New York and the state of New York and the federal government about. And the mayor of the city of New York at the time, Ed Koch, when asked by a New York Times reporter about the complaints that we were making, he referred to us as a bunch of screaming mimes and that there was really nothing going on. And I've been on a tear ever since. That was like, 1986, 85. I've been on a tear ever since about that, right? I'm still pissed off and the man is dead. How dare you call us a bunch of screaming mimes? And anybody who ever went by our community on the highway, on the West Side Highway, the Henry Hudson Parkway, you would know when you got to our community because you would have to hold your breath, and hope to God that you were not stuck in traffic because you wouldn't be able to breathe. We had our own climate. We had a mosquito infestation 12 months a year in New York City. We had an unbelievable rodent infestation. We were overcome. And his response was that we were a bunch of screaming mimes. So I took into that process for the summit and every dialogue that I'm ever a part of, any discussion that I'm ever a part of, give people information so that they can make decisions about their own lives, right? Give people what they need so that they can drive the process to decide what is right for them and their families. Not what I think is right, what they think is right. And that they stand on that. And that's what we had coming out of the summit. And I've been this past few weeks have been a lot of celebrations of the 30th anniversary. So I've been with a lot of friends that have been my friends and colleagues for 30 years. And they're all a bunch of badasses. Some of them are in their 70s and they're still a bunch of badasses, right? Driving all kinds of stuff. Mililani Trask is, one of the most renowned human rights lawyers at the UN, but she's been leading the struggle for the take back of indigenous people's land, Native Hawaiian land in Hawaii forever, right? Mililani wrote that principle that's about indigenous land rights and sovereignty. She wrote that herself, sitting right in front of me. She wrote that. And you ask her today, I just asked her on Tuesday, she said it's one of the proudest moments of her life was being able to do that. And that was 30 years ago. That woman has driven people at the UN crazy, right? Because she's such a badass. But that meant everything to her, that process. We had an 18-year-old and a 19-and-a-half-year-old were part of the drafting committee of the Principles of Environmental Justice. One of them's name is Mia Yoshitani. Mia was part of the conversation on Tuesday night. She was 19, and now she's the executive director of the Asian Pacific Environmental Network. Another bad ass. But she was there as a student, right? She was a student organizer, and she was a member of the drafting committee. So, I think all you need to do is give people the ability to make the decisions about what affects their lives. And that's really, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do in the environmental justice space, is give people information, create space at the table, or create new tables so that they can drive decisions that affect their own lives. And I know for me personally, it has meant everything to me to be able to stand up and speak with and on behalf of folk where I lived, to see the air get cleaner, to see less people die because of work that we did and continue to do. I can't imagine that I could do anything else that would be more satisfying than knowing that, that the folks in West Harlem, the folks in Northern Manhattan, the folks in New York City, they are extremely empowered. Sometimes they're a little too empowered, when I'm trying to get them to calm down, but there is no stopping the energy, right? People are on fire. And you saw it, Katie, when folks were in town for the throwdown around energy policy and around pipelines, right? They were out in front of there's 6 kids still out there, right? On a hunger strike. Folks are empowered. And if we haven't done anything that we have given people a sense of control over their own lives, that's worth the price of the ticket.
Thank you. That's absolutely right. Dennis and John, do you want to add to anything that Vernice just said?
Sure. I'd like to, really re-emphasize the point that Vernice was making about process, because that's very important. And decisions are going to be made. And as I stated earlier, it's important to be at the table. I encourage young people and other people with from the community to get involved with the process. Get involved by joining some of these nonprofit boards. Understand how the inner workings of these boards affect things that will affect and have impact on our everyday lives, but also being a part of the decision making that's going to make the difference as to policies that move forward, and from those policies and through those policies also come resources. A lot of those resources are your own money, your tax money is, and I always emphasize, I talk to the city representatives and we have conversations, and I make a point to them. You are talking about my money. So I don't tell me how you're going to spend my money. Let me tell you how I want my money spent. So these are things that's going to be very important. And as I can't emphasize more, become a part of these nonprofit boards if you have an opportunity to do so. I've been on several, and one of the things that I've carried to every one of those boards is, and I've been fortunately successful in getting diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice committees established on these boards. And these are things that are going to carry forward into the future. I'm working with one right now that's celebrating their 50th anniversary, and they have adapted the most, I would say, the really an extremely good diversity, equity, and inclusion policy within that organization, and that's going to carry forward for the next 50 years. So these are things that's important, and I just like to really emphasize how important it is to be involved and get in the process. Vernice was talking about being where she had access to that little bit of money, $4 million, and how it had to go a long way, but she learned how to use that money and be involved in that process, and at least how to get it out into our communities where some of that work could be done. So I just wanted to piggyback on that and say, get involved with the process. It's very important to know that.
John, do you have anything to add?
All right, cool. So as something that Vernice mentioned earlier, the two people, one was an 18-year-old, one was a 19-year-old and a half, who actually did a major part into creating the new, not really laws, but like sorry, let me rephrase this, who basically helped create what we're going over now. Like, you don't have to be let me say like over the age of 50 or 40
right.
to be involved. Like, there have been kids that I've worked with who have gone way harder into like getting the trash out and the pollution than I've seen many other people. Like, these kids, like when I see them actually working together and like learning about what was inside the river, the disgusted faces that they make from finding certain items, the joy they get from saying, "Oh, hey guys, look, I just found an 8-ball." Like, they still, like, for them to be able to learn while at that age, like the problems and the things that are inside of the river and what they can do to help, is very encouraging. And I just wish more youth would be, especially our schools, would be able to like help students become more knowledgeable about that fact and what they can do. Because once we're gone, like, they're the ones that's going to have to take care of all this stuff. Like,
Right.
it's sad to say, but yeah, it's just the truth. Like, they're going to be the ones responsible for a lot of things that are going to be happening. Like, they're the ones that's going to be affected by the work that we have completed and work that we have not completed. So that, as you mentioned earlier, those two who brought a major part into what we had spoken about earlier, it really brings a smile to my face. And I hope that more people, whether old or young, would help out, whether it's like physically getting into the river or physically going to your communities and picking up trash or advocating for more equal rights, or just in general getting rid of certain chemicals and pollutants. But also just, make sure that your voice is heard, like between friends, family, or in general. Just make sure your voice is heard and make sure that it's the actual right voice of what to do.
Here, here.
You're
Mhm.
here. Thank you, John. So, in the interest of time, because Vernice is going to jump to another event, and maybe Vernice, you can share that with us so we can catch it later or this evening. I wanted to ask two things. One, there are two questions remaining from the panel and maybe, or from the audience, and maybe Vernice and Dennis and John, y'all can respond to them in the chat while you also, multitasking here, while you also respond to the final question that I have for you. So the two questions that if you could put in the chat, that would be great. We have one from Samantha asking, is there money associated with the bills you mentioned, Vernice?
I put an answer in the chat
Okay,
to
you're
that
on
one
it.
already.
You're on it. Okay, so then there's another question from Myra. Has DC Water resumed giving tours of their plant? Taking tours of the plant, especially for young people, would spark an interest in our drinking water. So maybe John and Dennis, if you have an answer, you can put that in the chat. But the question that I'm going to ask you to wrap up this evening is what sustains you? What gives you strength to keep going? And where does that come from? And maybe Vernice, you wanna start?
The work is hard, but it's also a lot of fun being on a journey with a group of people for this long a period of time, right? When I saw folks on Tuesday night, some of those folks I hadn't seen in 15 years. And it was like we were together last week. But also, we've also lost a lot of people, including Brother Damu, who was an institution here in the district. Damu died in 2005. Dana Alston died in 1999. He's a DC folk. And so many other people that I don't know that, maybe Dennis knows, who were, his contemporaries. We've lost a lot of people before their time in the EJ movement, but the ones of us who are still here, we're still standing and we're still hanging tough. And, when I see Dennis, it is always a source of joy, just deep, deep, deep joy for me. And every time I'm involved in something in DC, I make sure that, people know about Dennis and his work and that Dennis is in the room. And so the lifting up, the building of community, a community that has lasted this long of people together, it's a family. And that is what sustains me. They're also hysterically funny. We try not to take ourselves too seriously. It's life and death work that we're doing, but you gotta have some joy about it, right? So one of the things I miss the most about Damu Smith is that he was a very intense brother, but he threw some of the best parties you ever wanted to go to in the District of Columbia. Oh my God. People would come from all over to go to these parties. At the summit, you would think Damu was a supreme organizer. You would think that, he would be involved in some other thing. You know what he was responsible for at the summit? The cultural program, the spoken word, the music. The artists, the local artists, getting them in the space with us so that we would have time to celebrate. And yes, we had parties too. So, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council for EPA used to meet all over the country. And I hope that they will resume that practice. 1 meeting in DC and 2 meetings in other parts of the country. And we would have public comment at that meeting. The meeting would stop, let's say at 7 o'clock at night. And then we would have public comment, and people would have come from all over that region to testify to EPA and to the NEJAC. And the public comment could go until midnight. And I usually shut down at about 10. So I was doing my level best to still be listening at midnight, right? And then these people would go and have a party after that. That I did not know that they were having a party. Years went by and I did not know that they were having a party. So I'm like, what am I, a chopped liver? And somebody said, we thought you were antisocial. I was like, oh, you got to be kidding me. Nobody has ever thought that I was antisocial. I just had to go to bed if I was going to roll the next day, right? And keep on the conversation. But John, I just want to say to you that the work is intense, but we have to take the time to celebrate with the people who are in that work with us. We have to take the time to, to step back for a moment and just appreciate the gifts that we have that enable us to be able to do this work. But you got to just, you got to party. I'm just a fervent supporter in partying, right? And I don't mean knock down, drag out, act a fool. I mean, good music, dancing, lifting up go-go. The things that the district is known for, not losing the culture. The culture is just as important as the work because the culture keeps the work going. So
That's right. Yeah.
I would just say that is what gives me support and joy is being able to continue to do this work with people that I love and respect.
Thank you. I'm going to kick it to John and then we'll close with Dennis. John, what keeps you going? Why do you go into work and do this day in and day out?
Well, I gotta say that working here is pretty fun for me. Working with the animals, the co-workers that I have here, going into trash shops, like even though like, yes, full of pollution and at times you really do have to debate with yourself whether you should go full on in there with the waiters, but it is interesting to see what's inside of here and know that you're actually doing something about it. Like there are 5 different trash shops that we collect from, and every time I go to those trash shops and clear them out, like every time I see different fish, frogs appear from out the woodwork, different insects, because the area is clear and it's just a beautiful sight to see. Once that entire area is no longer filled with pollution and trash. And then there's also the teaching aspect of it. I do enjoy when people are able to learn about the raptors, about what we do here at Earth Conservation Corps, as well as the physical projects that we do. Recently, we're actually, today I came back from Lower Maryland because we're building an eagle aviary. So with captive guardian youth who are trying to create, not create, but gain their GED, as well as learn life skills because they are no longer in the school system. But working with those youth, talking with them, doing the actual projects and making sure that, or in general, just having fun with the people around me is one reason why I'm able to stay and continue the work that I do.
Thank you. And Dennis, what about you? What sustains you? What keeps you going?
Well, I'll have to say a number of things. One of the things I have to give credit to having a wonderful wife who I've been married to for 51 years and who has never done anything other than support me in my efforts and work. Sometimes, I even would question myself as to, wow, is she really going to be behind me on this because it's taking time away from her, my children, so forth. But I definitely have to credit my wife and my family for being kind of the wind beneath my wings. But also, it's so gratifying. I mean, I see, hearing a young brother like John talk about the work that he's doing. And, I remember I was instrumental in bringing on board 4 of those litter capturing devices, those trash traps, was able to get the first one in the whole Western Hemisphere installed in Watts Branch in Kenilworth Park. And now you have a young man like John with his sleeves rolled up, putting on those waders and leading other young people into those litter capturing devices, still removing the trash and debris from them. The accomplishments of those things really are, what keeps me moving, keeps me going, and has me involved. And the work. I mean, I'm not a workaholic, but it is really gratifying. Every time I get involved with the project and see it through to its completion, and see the benefits that it provides to the local community and to the people. Those are the things that really keep me going.
Thanks, Dennis. Thanks, Vernice. Thanks, John. We are approaching the end of our evening. And I want to thank John, Vernice, and Dennis for what has been an amazing conversation and a beautiful way to close out the Knowing Our Past, Creating Our Future series that Current Movements and Visionary Organizing Lab and the Anacostia Community Museum have carried on for the last, I think it's maybe over a year. It's been a long time. We've done 5 of these events. And the way that y'all showed up today and shared yourselves and your work with us, Vernice, John, and Dennis is just is a beautiful way to honor the work we've tried to do. I want to acknowledge and thank Janelle Cooper and Mark Bratsfelder for doing the behind the scenes technological work. Not just for tonight, but for all the series, because if it wasn't for y'all, we'd be sitting here in the dark talking to ourselves. And y'all have held us down incredibly, even when we tried to turn this into a workshop, and y'all came back and dealt with us another time after that. So we want to extend some gratitude and acknowledge y'all's contributions and hard work. I want to ask all of the discussants to utilize the chat so that folks can learn how they might learn more about your work or get a hold of the organizations y'all work with and represent. I want to thank everybody for showing up and for the audience in the chat and so forth. I want to thank Current Movements and the Anacostia Community Museum so that we can bring this all together. With that, we'll bring back Katrina and we'll wish y'all a good night.
Thanks, Matt. I just want to echo Matt's sentiments. I just want to thank everyone, our hosts, our panelists, for just kind of creating really powerful, instructive conversation, which I think is basically is a hallmark of the work the museum has been doing over the past 5 decades. And to our attendees, thank you for zooming in. I know being from a screen all day and joining us at the end of your evening or in the middle of your day, depending where you are. But please, I hope you continue to join us for further conversations as we plan for the next year. We'll have more environmental programming, other discussing issues that really intersect in terms of our lives and our communities and people kind of working to move the needle forward and address issues that really impact every aspect of our lives. So once again, thank you for joining us. Please take care. And the video will be made available shortly. So please stay safe. Have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Katrina. Also, we need to shout out Samir McGelly.
Oh, yes,
yes. Together to begin this series in the first place. The brother just had a new baby, so he couldn't be here tonight. But Samir is the reason this whole series existed, and we came together in the first place. So,
all right. Congratulations, everyone.
Indeed.
Take
Thank
care.
you,
Enjoy your
everyone.
evening.
Have a great night.
Good
Have
night,
a good night,
wonderful
everyone.
people.
Bye, Vernice. Good luck
Bye,
with
y'all.
your event.
Love you.
thanks, y'all.